welcome back to the Collegian Football Podcast. Ben Ferree, joined as always by Evan Patrick. Today's episode, we're going to be previewing the Penn State offense ahead of the rapidly approaching blue-white game. Spring football is in full swing for Penn State after a break from last year. But before we get into all of that, Evan, how are you doing today?
I'm doing well, man. It's definitely springtime here in Pennsylvania. The weather's starting to turn. We're getting consistent warm days and all that. And I mean, yeah, spring game just about a week away. So I think it's exciting times here for Penn State football.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think there's really isn't many times better than spring in state colleges. So nice just to be outside and just after a brutal winter, although this year wasn't that bad. But anyway, kind of getting into the position previews right away. I think we're just going to take it position by position, then, kind of wrap it up at the end. So just kind of starting at the quarterback position. I mean, I think we've talked about this a bunch already on a couple different podcasts so far this semester, the quarterback position for Mike Yurcich's offense, obviously the new offensive coordinator coming in. And I think, again, it's Sean Clifford's job at this point, as far as we know. It doesn't seem like anything's going to be changing there. Taquan Roberson is going to be the backup. And then from there, things are kind of unknown for Penn State. We're still waiting to hear if there's any action in the transfer portal. It's probably the longer this goes on, the less likely. Maybe after spring ball, something would pop up there with the quarterback leaving another school. But as of right now, this fully seems Sean Clifford's job heading into another year in Happy Valley.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, this has been probably the topic we've covered the most through the off season. There's a lot of buzz just out there. I feel like around like Penn State fans not being satisfied with the quarterback position right now. And I mean, it's hard to blame them after last season with Clifford struggling so much. And I mean, there being an eventual quarterback change and then Clifford getting his job back and then Will Levis transfers. And now you're down to just one guy in Sean Clifford that really has any experience as a college football starting quarterback. And so it's going to be interesting having just him with Roberson and then Valu behind him. I think the question is Clifford going to be able to get back to his first season as a starter self? Like, will spring ball and more preparation be what he needs to maybe fix some of those mistakes? Will Mike Yurcich be maybe the quarterback whisperer that Penn State is hoping he's going to be for Clifford? I think that's kind of the main question that is going to be answered in the fall. Like, it's going to be the first few games when Clifford's out there. I think it's going to be pretty indicative of how his season is going to go. And I think that for me, it's tough to kind of think about what the improvement is going to look like, because you have spring ball now and you have Mike Yurcich and you have this dynamic up-tempo offense. But when you go back and you look at last season, the problems with Sean Clifford weren't necessarily schematic problems. They weren't necessarily making the wrong reads. He was making the right. It was all accuracy. It was mechanics. It was accuracy, and it was execution. And I don't know how much preparation and how much a new system can impact that. And that's going to be the question that everyone has on their minds. I mean, maybe we'll see something in the blue-white game. Even we don't really even know what we're getting from that last spring practice. But I think that if you're a Penn State fan, you're at the quarterback position. You're simply looking for Sean Clifford to be a consistent and accurate thrower, and that'll solve a lot of the problems that came up last season.
No, absolutely. I mean, I think as we kind of go through the rest of this offense, there is plenty of weapons on this Penn State offense this season, and I think there's no shortage of talent around Sean Clifford. So, I think, like you said, it's just that consistency, managing the game, doing that right, and he will be fine, and Penn State will be fine. But I think it kind of poses a bigger question, though, about, I mean, what is next for Penn State at the quarterback position? I mean, is Sean Clifford good enough to, potentially lead them to be a Big Ten champion, like a national championship contender? And I think from what we've seen the last 2 years, it's no. But I don't think really Penn State has anyone else on the roster right now that would be that caliber or is showing that promise. I mean, I think it's an interesting spot for Penn State at the quarterback position when you don't have that like superstar player. I mean, I know there's some talented recruits, and Valu, like you mentioned, he's a very talented recruit. Roberson had a lot of stars coming out of high school. I mean, Sean Clifford had a lot of stars coming out of high school. So, I mean, it's just an interesting place to be for Penn State. And I think another question is Penn State goes to Wisconsin the first week of the season. if Sean Clifford plays bad, how long does Penn State ride with Sean Clifford? Do they put Roberson in right away the next day? I mean, where does Penn State kind of go here? Because they have a very tough schedule to open up the year. At what point, how much trust do they have in Sean Clifford to work out a few kinks early in the season, playing tough oppositions where he, might not play the best game? Are they going to be patient with that? Are they going to rush to put Roberson in? I think there's a lot of questions there. Is how much trust do they have in Sean Clifford? I mean, I think through hearing James Franklin talk these last couple of weeks, it seems like they're fully entrusted in Sean Clifford. I expect him to be better than last year, but I don't think Sean Clifford will be the quarterback of promise for Penn State that'll lead them to a Big Ten championship. I don't think he will be that guy. But for Penn State, do you sit around and let him run the team for another year, possibly where he won't be that guy? I mean, I think there's a lot of questions here. Now I'm just going in circles, but it's like Sean Clifford is going to be the guy this year. I think he'll be better. I think just another year, spring practice, he'll actually have time to adjust to this new offense, unlike last year. And that'll help him a lot in just kind of executing. I mean, because he, like you said, he made the right reads. He was in the right positions, but the execution wasn't quite there. That might have been just a lack of reps. That might have been just not being fully comfortable. So, I mean, that sort of thing. Sean Clifford will be better, but I don't think it'll be quite enough to take Penn State to that next level. But then there's a whole question of what do you do if Sean Clifford struggles? Where do you go from there? It's all going to have to wait to see until these first couple weeks of the season. And Penn State's not going to have a schedule that allows them to ease into it like in some years past. So it will definitely be really interesting. And yeah, I mean, this is something that we've talked about a lot throughout the entire spring, winter, really since the end of Penn State's season last year. The question was the quarterback position. What's next for Penn State? I think my semi-hot take on this is Sean Clifford starts every game in the fall for Penn State. I don't think Penn State has confidence in Taquan Roberson. And I know that they're speaking very highly of him to the media and everything these last couple weeks during spring ball. But I think if Penn State was more confident in Roberson, he would have saw the field last year at some point, and he didn't. So I think that shows that Penn State has a lot more confidence. There's a big gap in confidence there between Clifford and Roberson. I think Sean Clifford ends up starting the whole season. I think he has a decent year. I'm not sure how much better he will be than 2 years ago. I would probably expect like a similar year. But with the talent Penn State has around him, if Sean Clifford, just like you said, has a decent year, manages games well, doesn't turn the ball over, executes in a big moment here and there, they're a team that will be in a New Year's Six Bowl, will be runner-up behind Ohio State in the Big Ten East, which for Penn State at this point, that's a successful season, especially coming off of last year.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I totally agree with you. I think this season you're going to see more of Sean Clifford 2 years ago than this past season. I think that he's going to get back to kind of his old self. And we talked about it briefly, but he has all of the weapons that he needs to succeed this season. Unlike last season, where the wide receiver position was a huge question mark, you get into the season, the running back room is turned on its head with the injury to Noah Cain and Journey Brown's medical retiring. And then Pat Frymuth eventually, gets surgery, and the weapons were more of a question mark last year than they are going into this year. Like the skill position groups that Sean Clifford has to work with this year are really talented, and especially the run game is going to be something they can totally lean on. And you mentioned the schedule, which I think is a really huge talking point. Is this is the year where you would love to have just that easy few non-conference games to blow some teams out in like the first half, and then bring in Roberson, give him some in-game experience, let him play so you're confident if you need to bring in a backup quarterback. You don't get that this year. You got to hit the ground running. You got to be as ready as you can be to just ride with Clifford, and he's going to have to be the guy because, yeah, I agree with you. I don't think that there is that same, not nowhere near the same trust in Roberson to take things over. And I mean, the depth of the quarterback position is definitely something to kind of be concerned about, honestly, if they don't bring someone in from the transfer portal, because you've only got 3 scholarship quarterbacks. And James Franklin said earlier this spring, like, you want to have 5. You can make 4 work, but 3 is where it gets dicey. And that's where they're sitting right now. And I was thinking about this today. It kind of brings the point, like, in the fall, what if COVID testing is still in the same form that it was this past season? What if one guy tests positive in the quarterback room, maybe 2, because they're going to be working together? Like, if Penn State could very well be like starting a walk-on quarterback if things like go really wrong, because they just don't have the depth of the position this year. And I think it's definitely a storyline to keep an eye on. But then again, I mean, if you look at Penn State's history last season, they did a phenomenal job managing COVID. So I think that's not going to be something to worry about too much. But with that depth chart looking the way it is, there's always going to be a little bit of concern.
No, absolutely. I mean, I think that's a really, really good point. It's certainly for Penn State a spot you don't want to be in, lacking depth at a quarterback position. I mean, they learned firsthand last year at the running back position you can never have too much depth. And look at me bringing a transition here. Speaking of the running backs, moving on to our next offensive position, running back for Penn State, like we said last year, a room that was considered the best in the country heading into the season got completely flipped on its head with Noah Cain getting hurt, Journey Brown having to medically retire. This year, I think, again, this Penn State running back group, so talented. I think it looks like Noah Cain likely will probably be in the starting role come this fall. John Levitt comes in from Baylor. He'll be in the mix there. Kevon Lee as well. Those are probably going to be Penn State's top 3 backs heading into the season. But then you also have Keziah Holmes. I mean, this Penn State running back room has so much depth and will certainly be a big part of the Syracuse offense and helping Sean Clifford at times, especially again through those first couple weeks. If they can go to Madison, establish a run game, use some of these guys out of the backfield and that sort of thing in this new high tempo offense. I mean, I think this Penn State running back room looks set for certain success.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, they just have so many guys, and I'm going to be frank here. I'm surprised none of them entered the transfer portal at the end of last season. I mean, you mentioned you have Noah Cain coming back from injury. Kevon Lee, who really took over that starting role last year, is kind of like the dominant feature back for this Penn State team. You've got a guy, Devin Ford, who was the starter effectively when Brown and Cain went down, and then you have Keziah Holmes and and with Lovett coming in, there's just so many guys there that like could be vying for carries throughout the entire season. And so I'm going to be interested to see how they kind of approach the running back position, because I mean, last season going into it, we were told that Kirk Ciarrocca wanted to run a running back by committee, have like a lot of guys. He did that in Minnesota, really rotated in a bunch of different backs. But we didn't see that as much because I mean the circumstances changed drastically. But like this position, along with the wide receiver position, are just so deep and so set for success. I want to say, like, even if guys get injured at the running back position or something happens like last year, you're still set with guys like all the way down the depth chart. And I think that, yeah, like you said, Noah Cain and Kevon Lee are going to be probably the 2 main guys that are going to be getting carries. And like that combo with just the running style of those 2, I would hate to be a defensive lineman or a linebacker with just trying to deal with the power styles of Noah Cain and Kevon Lee. And then you have Ford as more of a shifty back, and then trying to see where Lovett fits into all of this. They have so many options, and I think that they can get really creative with what they want to do in the run game.
I think you could have a lot of fun with 2-back systems, with it being, Cain, Lee, or, like Holmes and Lovett. I mean, I think you can have a lot of fun with some of these different 2-back combinations. And I hope that's something we see a good bit of in this Penn State offense this season. I mean, I think there's a lot of possibilities there, whether it's running, passing, whatever. But no, this group is so deep. I mean, I think kind of looking at this running back room, I mean, Penn State has, Noah Cain, Kevon Lee, John Lovett, probably Keziah Holmes would start at a decent number of Power 5 schools. I mean, that's 4 deep for Penn State. And then Devin Ford would likely be in contention in most running backs rooms as either a second string guy or possibly a first string guy. I mean, this entire running back room could either be first or second string at probably a Power 5 schools of their choice. I mean, I would say barring like an Alabama or an Oklahoma or something like that. But for the most part, I mean, this group is 5 deep with talented players. And I think it will be a real shame for Penn State in this offense if they don't find a way to utilize them to their fullest potential. And I think another thing is no eligibility was lost last year because of COVID. So Kevon Lee and Keziah Holmes are both true freshmen again, listed on the depth chart. So they just got a free year last year, which is really setting up Penn State for the future. I mean, when you look at this running back room, as far as eligibility, I mean, Lovett is a senior, then Cain is a sophomore, Ford is a sophomore, Lee and Holmes are both freshmen coming into this season because there was no eligibility again last year. I mean, and they all have experience at this point as well. I mean, there isn't much more you can ask for at this running back position if you're Penn State. I mean, I think it's almost hard to describe sometimes because there isn't much they ask for. They have every different type of runner you could want. They have good power guys. They have good skill guys. I mean, talented out of the backfield in the passing game. I mean, it's everything you want in that running back position. Penn State has it. They have depth, and I would expect them to feature highly in this offense in the fall. And I think one of the things is, like you mentioned, Evan, is we'll see how much they rotate running back by committee and that sort of thing. If Penn State's running as high tempo of an offense as we expect, there's going to be some tired legs at times. So I would imagine there will be some fair sharing of carries, but I think once you see the offense get going, there won't be much like in drive substitutions likely. But I would say you'll see a good rotation of guys, especially with the tempo Penn State's expecting to play at it. That depth will be used and put together. And like you said, you never know if a COVID situation comes up or something like that.
Well, yeah, absolutely. And I think that having such a deep running back room, I mean, it's never a bad thing, but especially we've heard so much about this high tempo offense. I mean, every player we've talked to about Mike Yurcich's offense in practice it's really high tempo. They're really going to be playing fast. And you do that in order, you want to tire out defenses and you want to be able to be in better shape than them and beat them late in the game, beat them in the fourth quarter. If you're playing this high tempo offense the entire game, and you get to the fourth quarter and then, hey, you can throw on a fresh running back who is as talented as your top 2 or 3 guys as well, that just makes it so much more difficult on these defenses. And I think that's going to be very complimentary for the style of play that Mike Yurcich is going to be putting in for this Penn State team. And you look at this running back room, and it's crazy to kind of think that they have so many talented guys on the roster at one time. But it really just speaks to what Jaquan Seider has done from a recruiting perspective, what he's done to recruit the state of Florida, his home state. He's really been a great positional coach for this Penn State team. And Penn State, if you're a running back in high school and you get an offer from Seider in Penn State, why would you not want to go and play for him? I mean, this is kind of, you're seeing the effect of when you get a guy like Saquon Barkley, then you get a guy like Miles Sanders. That's how you end up with a running back room like this a few years down the road. That's the impact those generational talents have in terms of building roster and building success in the future. And it shows why being able to get those guys and develop them and have them be these huge national spotlight like players is because it pays off in recruiting, because kids hear about the running back room at Penn State and they want to go there. And now you have a 5 running back deep depth chart like this, and you're really set for success.
Yeah, I mean, coming to Penn State as a running back, I just need one season to play well, and I will be a 2nd round NFL draft pick because of that history at that point. But no, this running back room, I think one thing I just wanted to throw in there. I mean, I think Kevon Lee at times is very underrated and forgotten. For a guy who averaged, almost 5 yards a carry last year in a true freshman season, when he didn't enroll early with all of the changes going on to the college football last year, I think Lee could potentially be very, very scary given a year in the strength and conditioning program, a spring ball, summer practices. Like I think Kevon Lee could be a guy that you see take a massive, massive leap forward this year. And that's saying something because he was so good last year. But I think just his real dynamic ability, giving him another year with this program and a full off season, especially from a strength standpoint, I think Kevon Lee could be a very, very impressive running back come the fall for Penn State. But now kind of moving on to our next position group here, the wide receiver group, the group that we talked about like it was the quarterbacks last year. Going into spring practice before was canceled for Penn State last year. Everyone was questioning who was going to be the guy at wide receiver. Didn't seem like Penn State had too much there. There was a big point of concern. Jahan Dotson was really the only proven player on at that wide receiver. And even he had some doubts of whether he could be a number 1 receiver. How would he fit? Would he just kind of play in a slot role? But then who was going to Penn State use as that number 1 guy? There was just so many questions going into spring, summer, fall about the wide receiver position. And they all got answered. Jahan Dotson really proved he was a number 1 wide receiver. Just play the image of the catch against Ohio State on repeat as just one of the few of his big catches last year. And you also have Keandre Lambert-Smith, you have Parker Washington, and you have some older guys like Daniel George who will also probably play a role in this new offense, as well as some very talented freshmen as well. So this Penn State receiver room, again, like the running backs, really set up for success this season. And I think that combo of Dotson, Lambert Smith, Washington has to be considered one of the better groups in the Big Ten, if not in the country, coming into this year.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, going into last season, like you said, biggest question mark on the offensive side of the ball in terms of position groups, easily the wide receiver position. And now going into this year, it's the one you're probably least worried about if you're James Franklin and Mike Yurcich. I mean, Jahan Dotson has proved that he's a viable number one receiver. I would argue that he was the best receiver in the Big Ten last season. And having a guy like Parker Washington really step up and play the slot so well as a true freshman. And it was just a really, really impressive performance for that group all around because they needed it. And like, I mean, Sean Clifford was saying, or someone was saying how that the first time Sean Clifford threw to Parker Washington was like just a few weeks before like the first game of the season last year, because they didn't have any time to like work together. And the fact that they still went out and had such a rapport, and the fact that Washington was so productive as a true freshman with such a lack of preparation in person on the field, I think it can only get better for this group, and especially with this dynamic Yurcich offense that we're going to see. I think that the wide receivers are just going to see the fruits of that even more so. And I mean, we got to talk to Keaton Ellis on Tuesday, and he said that he's been really impressed with what he's seen from Keandre Lambert Smith as well, another guy who honestly a lot of people thought that maybe he was going to be the guy that Parker Washington was last season, and he's just going to take another step forward. Cam Sullivan-Brown was listed as a starter last season, and he ended up playing in a few games, but didn't really have much of an impact. He was dealing with some injury issues, and he's a guy that Penn State has back, along with Daniel George, as like two guys that are really going to sit in there as kind of that, like maybe on the fringe of that third receiver spot, really going to be that fourth guy. I mean, when Cam Sullivan-Brown and Daniel George are your guys at the fourth wide receiver position, I mean, Daniel George was a starting receiver 2 seasons ago, and portions of last season he was getting reps as well. And so the depth is there, the talent is there. It's really, really great for this team that Dotson came back, because it's a risk for him as well. It's a gamble, because he, going into last season, no one thought that he could do what he did, and then he did it. He had kind of the perfect season from his perspective. His draft stock probably as high as it is ever going to be, or as it ever was to that point, depending on what he does this season. He had a great year, and it's going to be tough to top that year. But I think that this Penn State offense is going to be great next season. He has all the tools to do it. And so I think the wide receivers are going to be a vital part of the offense. And I think they're set up for success.
No, absolutely. I mean, Dotson's definitely going to get a lot more attention from defenses this season than he got at times last year, especially earlier in the year. But no, like you said, I mean, I think very, very big for this Penn State offense to have Dotson come back, because I think there would be, I wouldn't say a big hole in the offense without Dotson there. The receiver position would have some question marks if Jahan Dotson decided not to return. I mean, would Daniel George or a Cam Sullivan-Brown would probably have to step up in that case and become a consistent starting player. And to this point in college, neither one of them has really shown that potential fully. I mean, they've shown it for brief moments, but fully consistently, it has not been there. I think Cam Sullivan-Brown was definitely been a little disappointing in that sense, I would say. I mean, I think last year going to, there was a lot of hype around him, didn't really end up on the field that much at all. So, I mean, I think there's definitely helps this Penn State receiver group so much. And I know that's just a simple thing to say, but I think there would be kind of a hole at that number one receiver position without Jahan Dotson. There'd be a little bit more question marks. But now, I mean, you have 3 receivers who are all returning. I think that's a big theme for this Penn State offense this season. And that's what we said at the running back position. Last year, a lot of people were kind of thrown into the fire, thrown into a position that they haven't been in before, probably weren't really ready to play, but they kind of had to. It was the only choice they had. And now these guys are back this season, going to be moving into full-time starting roles. They haven't, not only they have a season under their belt, they also will now have a whole offseason to grow in that role and come back this year without losing eligibility. And I think this is really setting Penn State up well for the future. I mean, I think these guys that are in here getting that playing time last year, Parker Washington doing what he did, and the Penn State depth was different than receiver. I mean, Parker Washington would have played. I mean, he did play not because of like injuries or anything like that, but when you have a true freshman like him perform like, or a sophomore perform like he did, and then now he is back again with a whole offseason under his belt, and you're going to see more growth from him. And I think that's just a big theme for this Penn State offense and this Penn State team in general. Is this team now has a lot of potential for the future here in a couple of years, just because they've all been playing so early in their careers and having that experience. Game experience is everything. I think for Penn State, the way they're kind of looking at it is last year we figured some things out. We worked out the kinks. We just got to figure it out. They figured it out after that 0-5 start. Was great to the end of the season. Now they're going to build off that in the offseason. And I think that's something that this Penn State team, if there's going to be like a real sleeper team, I think a lot of people are discounting Penn State because of last season. I think this team could be dangerous if some of these players play to their potential and grow off of last year, just because they're all experienced. And I think that's something that you just can't get, and you can't learn that on a practice field. You just got to do that by playing. And this Penn State group, receiver, no different, are just so experienced. And I think when you have guys like Daniel George, like Cam Sullivan-Brown, who are veterans, they're not in every play. They're not going to start. But if they come in, big catch here, big catch there, I mean, I think that's perfectly what you need and want from them. I think this group has tons and tons of potential. I mean, like we said back at the quarterback position, there is tons of weapons on this Penn State offense.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, you mentioned the wide receiver group being so much more experienced now, having that season on their belt, considering they had so many true freshmen that were kind of asked to step up and make plays. And moving to the tight end position, that's now the position that kind of has a question mark on it, because the departure of Pat Fryermuth. Now, Brenton Strange stepped up midway through the year, and I think he was really impressive with what he showed and what he did in the time that he came in. He seemed like a solid guy to have in there. And then he was also, when Penn State was in 12 personnel with Fryermuth, he was very complimentary there. But then behind Strange, you've got Theo Johnson, who I guess it's going to be so weird. I guess is still a true freshman. It's going to be so weird with how the eligibility works and how they're listed. But had his real true freshman season last year. You got a guy like Ty Warren coming in, or who came in last season and had to play as well. And I think that there's those similar question marks that the receiver group had last season for this tight end group. And I think they have the most to gain from this season, because they were guys when Fryermuth had surgery last season, they really benefited from that added playing time for a guy like Brenton Strange to get the second half of the year to be the starter and now know what it takes. He talked about how he's been kind of preparing differently, knowing that he's going to be the number one guy when we last talked to him this spring. And it's something he said he's ready for too. He's excited. He's looking forward to it. And I think Theo Johnson is a guy who's really could have a breakout season. I mean, he's a guy who's really highly regarded recruit coming out of Canada. And we saw him last season. And especially when Penn State goes in 12 personnel this year, having Strange and Johnson, I think they're two really dynamic pass catchers that can cause some linebackers some problems and some matchup nightmares just with their sheer size and athletic ability.
No, absolutely. I completely agree with you. And I don't have too much data on the tight end position, but I think people do kind of forget Brenton Strange was fourth on the team last year for Penn State in receptions. And I know that was partially due to Pat Fryermuth, being injured, only playing in 4 games in half the year. But when he left, Brenton Strange was able to fill that void. I mean, obviously, Pat Fryermuth is going to be one of the first tight ends drafted in the NFL draft. So, I mean, obviously, he's not going to be exactly the same caliber. I think Brenton Strange showed so much promise last year and really was able to fill that hole without there being too much of a drop-off from Pat Fryermuth. And I think that's really indicative to how much work Brenton Strange has put in and how talented he is. But like you said, I think Theo Johnson could really explode. I think he showed flashes of it last year, only had 4 catches. But I think as the year went on, Theo Johnson got more and more comfortable. Again, give him this offseason. Who knows what his potential could be in the fall. I mean, there's definitely been some question marks from there. But overall, I think this Penn State tight end group, especially with all the talent around them in the offense, you're not going to be able to fully stop Jahan Dotson, Parker Washington, Lambert Smith, and Brenton Strange all at the same time. I mean, all 4 of those players could hurt you at any moment. And that's not even mentioning the running backs. So I mean, I think there's definitely going to be some opportunities for Penn State if teams, focus more on Dotson, if teams focus more on Parker Washington. Brenton Strange could have a sneakily good year. Theo Johnson could also have a sneakily good year. I think this tight end group could be very important for Sean Clifford, depending on who's getting more attention on the offense from defenses. I think that's a big thing for Penn State this year is they're not going to be one-dimensional, or they shouldn't be one-dimensional. If they are one-dimensional, there's absolutely a bigger problem than what players Penn State has at this point, because the talent's there. They have talent at all of these positions. It's just getting it out there and having it execute. But I think Brenton Strange, Theo Johnson, I think you're not upset by that being your tight end room at all. I don't think you're too worried about it. And I think just naturally in an offense, you'd be more concerned with like younger receivers than tight ends just because of the role they play in the offense. But I think overall, Brenton Strange showed me enough last year where I'm fully confident in him as a number one guy. And I think Theo Johnson definitely could have that potential, especially given another year to kind of acclimate and grow. I think Theo Johnson by the end of this fall could be a really, really, really good player. I think it might take him a little bit in the season, but I think he will really grow. You're going to see a big difference from him week 1 to week 12. But I think that's really it for the tight end room. I don't think there's too much to go in depth with there. I mean, I think, again, talented, a bit young, some question marks. And then we move to the offensive line for Penn State. I think this is where there are some question marks for this Penn State team, but then again, it's a very experienced group when you kind of look across the board. Just going to kind of throw out, what we might see as a starting lineup: Rasheed Walker on the left, Des Holmes, Mike Miranda, Drew Scruggs, Caden Wallace. You have a Landon Tangwall in there, depending how he adjusts, possibly a Bryce Effner. Anthony Wiggin as well. Olaf Oshanu as well. So, I think Penn State definitely has some depth on this offensive line, but there definitely are, a couple question marks. But overall, I think this offensive line will be good enough to get Penn State where it wants to go. And I think you have to be excited about Rasheed Walker at left tackle.
Oh, definitely. Yeah. Rasheed Walker and his whole time here at Penn State has just been a stud for them. And he's been so crucial for them holding down that left tackle spot. And I think he's been one of their most consistent linemen over the last few years. And it's always going to be tough when you lose a Michael Mennett, and you lose a Will Fries, and it's going to be tough to replace those guys, just how with their veteran presence and how well they performed last year. I know Mennett had a bit of a down year, but he's still that veteran center, and the center position too is one where they're really setting the tone and connecting each side of the line communication wise. And so I don't know who they're going to end up going there. I want to say Miranda's been taking snaps at center. Drew Scruggs was a guy who came in as a center recruit and who has played some guard in his time here. And Drew Scruggs is a guy that I'm actually really excited to see get like solid run, because his story is incredible, with him battling back from the injuries he sustained in that car accident, and to going into last year and him finally getting back on the football field. And then when he was out there, he played really well. That guy is a force, especially in the run blocking game. Like he can move some bodies, and I think he performed really well. And I think he earned himself a starting spot heading into this season. And whether that be at center or whether that be at one of the guard spots, I think it's going to be really valuable. And then also you bring in Eric Wilson from Harvard, a guy who's going to probably take one of those guard spots as well, depending on how he meshes with the team as he's in these spring practices and what they see from him. I don't know. Penn State's been in a decent spot with the offensive line, I'd say the last 4 or 5 years, because there isn't that one year you can point to where it's like, all these, you're losing a full offensive line of starters. Every year you're losing 1 to 2, maybe 3 in a year guys that were key starters, but you're always bringing back some guys that started like a ton of games the last season. And I think those guys are going to have to really carry the team early on as they kind of figure out where they're going to go, what these lineups and rotations are going to look like at each spot. And because you listed all those names, all those guys are capable of taking a spot or taking one of the first 2 spots at any position on the depth chart. And so I think that these, like we mentioned again, the schedule for Penn State this year makes things tough because you don't really have time to figure things out in terms of positional rotations and who's going to be where personnel wise. But I think those first few games for the offensive line, there's maybe a bit more room to kind of figure things out and mix and match. And I think that's what we're going to see a lot of going into those non-conference games. And I think the offensive line will it'll figure itself out early on.
No, absolutely. And I think that's something we've seen Penn State do that a lot in the past in those early non-conference games, when they're playing like a Kent State or something where it's, all right, we'll try different offensive line combinations, kind of see what works, look at the film, kind of evaluate, go from there. But I think, like you said, there is a lot of versatility on this offensive line. I mean, Rasheed Walker is obviously locked into that left tackle spot. But kind of other than that, when you're looking at these other four positions, I mean, like Mike Miranda is not going to play at tackle. He's going to either play one of the guards at the center spots, but he could play either guard or the center spot. I mean, I think Des Holmes could play tackle if you need him to. Caden Wallace is on the outside playing tackle, could slide into guard if you really want to. I mean, like you said, Drew Shrugs, he can play guard, center, whatever. And I already mentioned Des Holmes. I mean, I think, and then you have like an Anthony Wiggin who can play either guard or tackle as well. So I mean, I think there's a lot of versatility on this Penn State offensive line, and they got a lot of guys that can really line up anywhere. And I think that'll be really interesting to see what the preferred starting five is, when they put out the first depth chart of the year, which should be coming very soon, I would imagine. And then what that looks like going into the first game of the season. Who's going to be starting where? How's that going to change throughout the year? I think there's a lot of flexibility there. I think you could easily rotate people around, find the best combination, but it's like you said, it definitely takes time to find that combination. Now, it's definitely going to figure itself out, but it's like, it's going to kind of have to happen before the first game of the year. Penn State doesn't really have 2-3 weeks to figure it out when it gets going. But I think exactly like you said, I think Penn State, they have a lot of talent who can kind of play anywhere. It might take it a couple weeks to fully be 100% going, but I think the amount of talent Penn State has, you might see a lot of different combinations in that Wisconsin game, depending how that game's going. And I don't think that's a bad thing. I think there's going to be a lot of competition. I think people are going to step up where they need to. You'll see people slide around. Someone's having a bad game. There'll be a little shift, whatever. I think you have that possibility at the offensive line position. And I think you love that as a coach when you have players who really can go anywhere. It makes your job so much easier. You can get the best five out there instead of, being forced to pick people certain places when you're not necessarily as good here, there, wherever. I think this offensive line group definitely has a lot of potential. And like you said, I mean, they're consistently losing one or two guys a year. I think looking into next year, I mean, now we're really getting, or the following year after that, really getting into the future at this point. You'll probably going to lose a Rasheed Walker after this year, likely. Des Holmes will be gone and Mike Miranda will be gone. So, I mean, I think the offensive line in 2 years from now could have some big holes to fill as well. But I think right now, looking at this offensive line, definitely a lot of options and a lot of talent. And I know I said it already. I think that's just the big overall takeaway for this offense. You have a lot of guys who probably shouldn't have played last year, but were forced to because of circumstances that are all back, ready to fill starting roles. And I do think this Penn State offense, assuming that they mesh with this Yurcich offense and that all goes smoothly, this really could be a scary offense for Penn State, and an offense that could really surprise people and take Penn State places that they're not really expecting to. I mean, this Penn State offense, I don't want to say it could be like that Big Ten championship caliber offense, but if things click the way we're expecting them to, this offense could score 30, 40 points a game, and I would not be shocked by that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in terms of the roster talent, I think that it's very much comparable, and it's really just going to boil down to execution and how well Yurcich's scheme really kind of fits with what everyone is comfortable with. And I think that his track record proves that that's something that we can expect. And I mean, the last thing I wanted to touch on in terms of the offensive line position is I'm excited to see the true freshmen that are coming in this season for Penn State. Landon Tengwall, 6'6", 300-pound, Penn State's top recruit in the 2021 class. He's a guy who enrolled early. He's participating in spring practice right now, and he's a guy that could be competing for that open tackle spot. And he's a guy that, I mean, you don't always see, especially Penn State true freshman getting a starting spot on the offensive line. But I mean, if someone's going to do it, it very well could be him. And then you also have Nate Bruce coming out of Harrisburg, 6'4", 320-pound guard. He's someone who's just going to be there for added depth and someone that is been getting a lot of praise too from coaches throughout the spring. And I think he's someone to keep an eye on for sure. I mean, that, like you said as well, this year is going to be very important for developing these guys that don't necessarily have as much starting experience, but are going to need that starting experience this year and a few years down the road.
No, absolutely. I think it's a very exciting time in general for Penn State and this offense. And I think sky could really be the limit. But that's going to do it for this episode of the Collegian Football Podcast. Hope you enjoyed. Evan and I'll be back next week, the same time, with a preview of the defense just ahead of the blue-white game. So make sure to stay tuned for that. Make sure to stay tuned at the Collegian for all of your Penn State football coverage, as I forget how to speak. Follow us on Twitter at PSU Footblog. Thanks for listening in.